Welcome back to Knowledge Resources Speaker Feature. Today, we're sitting down with Bryan Hopkins, who is a learning and development consultant with over 30 years of experience in the private and public sector for both the UK and abroad. Bryan has done much work with the UN in humanitarian and development space, and we're very excited to have him with us today because we'll be hosting a morning webinar in collaboration with Bryan on how to develop an effective, sustainable learning development strategy. This will be happening on the 12th of April this year. So if you enjoyed today's chat, be sure to tune in there as well. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here with you.
So Bryan, I've been reading up in preparation for this interview a lot on sustainability and what it means. And I do think there's a big stigma attached to the word. It's one of those words that almost makes you pause a little bit. Could you just take us through the real meaning of sustainability as it links to learning and development?
Yeah, I mean, sustainability is one of those terms which has been around for 30 or 40 years, I guess, and has always been a word which people have found very difficult to get their heads around. It's what people call a contested concept, which means that people think, well, it sounds like a really good idea, but when they actually get into the detail of it, when they actually try to pick it apart, then that's when the complexity comes up. So to go back to the beginning, if I just read through here, this book here, Our Common Future. This was a United Nations report published back in 1987, which looked at the increasing concerns being attached to environmental problems at that time, and put forward this idea that actually whenever we do something, whenever we take action, economic, organizational action, we should be seeking to deliver something which creates benefits for both our current and also our future generations. And that serves as a sort of starting point for the whole sustainability discussion, really. It's about thinking about whatever we do and how that can have an impact on our generation, our people, and our children and our grandchildren. I mean, I have 2 grandchildren of my own, and since becoming very sort of caught up in the sustainability world, every time I look at them, I think, well, what is the world going to be like for them in 50 or 60 years' time? And so that kind of is one of the things which drives me forward. So that's kind of the starting point for sustainability, I think.
This wonderful quote about every time you sit in the shade of a tree, it's because someone planted it 20 years previous. And I think that's a big train of thought here as well, is really investing in future generations. I'd like to take it a little bit to learning and development now. Are there any practices that you've seen that are currently unsustainable, or maybe that will become unsustainable in future?
Well, I think my particular interest is in how we develop strategies which promote sustainability. And in a sense, if you can do that effectively, you also start to develop what is a sustainable learning strategy about sustainability. One of the ideas which I think is really useful is to think about the difference between conforming and committing. I think a lot of the work that happens in organizations these days, currently, as regards learning and development, encourages what I call conforming, which is that the learning and development comes very much from a top-down perspective, that experts, senior management within the organization have, for better or for less effective reasons, have decided that a particular subject needs to be communicated, and it needs to be communicated in a particular way. And that what can happen is that then that simply is given to people, and they kind of nod their heads and they say, yes, okay. And they go away and they kind of go through the motions. They're conforming to what is being expected of them, but they're not necessarily committing to that. They're not saying, yes, this is really something which is of importance to me. I can really see the value in this. And so it tends to be superficial. And the problem with superficial learning and development is that, to start off with, you may have, sort of conformance. People do what they're told, but as time goes by, their enthusiasm for doing this in the officially approved way starts to fade away, and so they start to go back to whatever they were doing before, which may not be in the interests of the organization. So I think it's really important that with learning and development that we actually pay closer attention to where people are in their lives, what their particular sets of values are, what is important to them, and find a way of integrating what's important for an organization with what's important for people in the workforce so that they commit. And I think in that way, we start to develop a sustainable learning and development strategy. And when we ally that with looking at what the organization does and how that benefits future generations, then we're starting to develop something which is also sustainable in that kind of broader sense.
Amazing. So there's quite a lot of responsibility on the learning and development specialist actually to really drive this, to find ways of connecting to the staff and the organization and really make this a viable and connective reality, if I can use the word connective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something of a, to use a kind of a popular phrase, it's going to be something of a paradigm shift for learning and development. I think one of the problems that has happened in the human resource development profession over the last 30, 40 years, particularly in, I can't speak for the South African situation, but in the United Kingdom and the United States, we've become very much absorbed by a kind of a political economy which prioritizes the individual, which prioritizes personal choice, personal interest, and sees the idea of working together as a society, as a community, as of being something that has to be treated with some suspicion. I don't think it's quite the same in continental Europe. There's organizational structures in, for example, Germany place much greater emphasis on worker participation through people being, through trades unions being represented on boards of organizations, and through making sure that the workforce is got a very comprehensive sort of level of skill and understanding of what it is they're doing. But in other parts, such as my own country, the United Kingdom, I think human resource development has been kind of co-opted into this very sort of instrumental way of looking at how organizations work, and that's been at the expense of thinking about the broader identities and value frameworks that employees bring with them.
I'm so happy to have you here with all this international experience. And I know you've mentioned that South Africa is maybe not a case you've worked with before, but I would like to ask you about a specific scenario, I would say, that South Africa is in at the moment. We have one of the highest inequalities in the world, especially in concerning learning and development, because there's such a huge skill gap and education gap. And especially considering your work with the UN and with less developed countries, do you have any advice for learning and development specialists who find themselves in this unsustainable situation and what they can do in future to sort of mitigate these effects?
Well, sustainability has got a number of different dimensions. So when we talk about sustainability, I think what often springs into people's minds is the idea of environmental sustainability. We're all very conscious about, climate change. I know that Southern Africa has been gripped by waves of drought in recent years. Other parts of the world have been flooded. Other parts of the world are suffering from wildfires. We have concerns about the availability of fresh water, about biodiversity, and all that kind of environmental, stuff. But I think another dimension of sustainability is what's generally called social sustainability, which is about how whatever we does affects the ways in which our society works together, and there's a strong connection between the two. So for example, if like I was talking about the individualism which which modern culture can promote. Individualism can be at the expense of the environment, because it means that we're all looking for, the newest cars, the newest phones, the newest everything, but all that comes at an environmental cost. But also, we want to improve ourselves and our way of life, and what we do, but that's not necessarily sort of going to be in the best interests of our society as a whole. So one of the things which I think organizations need to think about is how they contribute to social sustainability. So that begs the question of what it actually does social sustainability mean, because it's kind of easy to think about biodiversity and and all of those kind of issues. Not necessarily easy to do anything about it, but it's easier to understand it. But for social sustainability, it's much less well understood. So through all the research that I've done, is that three particular things have come to mind, seem to be important. One is basic needs, which is making sure that everybody has access to sort of food, water, and shelter. Basically, those are the kind of things. If people have those three things, and they can get hold of them safely and reliably and confidently, then they're much better able to engage with the world. They're much better able to actually work effectively in an organization. The second thing is about social cohesion, is about how the society as a whole works together, how people interrelate with each other. And the third thing is about social equity. Equity being making sure that people have equal access to services that they need, to facilities and things like that. And that's something which I can completely understand that is of some of great importance in South Africa, given its history over the last since Second World War, really, and the apartheid era, and then the transformation to where you are now. So basic needs, social equity, and social cohesion. And in an organization, there's kind of two ways of looking at that. One is the external social sustainability that the organization promotes. So what does your organization do to make sure that people in your community, and that could be the whole country, or it could be your own city or your own village, it could be, what does it do to make sure that everybody around you has the basic needs that they require? What does it do to promote social cohesion? And what does it do to promote social equity? So that's kind of the external aspect of social sustainability, but also it's got an internal component as well. So for example, in your workforce, do you ensure that your workforce has everything they need to be able to work safely? Do they have access to good water where they're working? Do they have access to the food they need to sustain them during the day? Do they have good employment rights? What are the contracts of employment that you offer for your employees? One of the concerns that we have these days in the United Kingdom is about the rise of what we call the gig economy, which is self-employed people who are just waiting for a text message to say, can you work a shift for us? And they have to immediately drop everything and go and work. If they say no, I can't do it, then the organization will say, well, you're unreliable, we're not going to call you again. So that's really not providing people with the basic needs and helping with the social cohesion which is needed in a workforce. So the organization also needs to think about what its social equity sort of perspective is, and that in turn that works in terms of how do you discriminate against different groups. That may be against women, for example, and that's probably one of the areas which is most widely researched. And one of the ways in which that operates at a very kind of sort of hidden level, or at least hidden for a man, is in the simple thing of the provision of toilets. That very often in office blocks, that toilets are built on an equal basis. So there's the same number for men and the same number for women. But that everywhere, all the women I know all complain about the problem is there's not enough toilets, because because of biological functioning, means that women spend longer in a toilet, so and they and they use a toilet differently. So that that is just something which isn't considered really. And also in terms of race, I mean, how does your organization's policy discriminate against, sort of people with a different racial background, religion, disability, wheelchair access, all of these kinds of things. So these are all aspects of sustainability which are relevant to an organization. And I think, from a learning and development point of view, then learning and development is, in a sense, it operates as like the moral compass of an organization. Most people in an organization are interested in getting the job done, in working out what needs to be made, how something needs to be sold, how it needs to be distributed. And their concern is to do that effectively. And they may not have the perspective to be able to think, are we doing this in a sustainable way? Is this fair on our workforce? What impact is this having on our community? HRD, people responsible for learning and development, they are a little bit more detached from that, and they should be able to just see the bigger picture about how the organization operates, and then use their role in running learning programs and facilitating people's understanding about issues in a way which actually strengthens the organization's commitment, or even initiates the organization's commitment towards sustainability. So, long answer, but I hope it answers your question.
It does. There's a lot to unpack there, and I appreciate it so much, because I think it's one of the things I found most interesting in researching your work previous to this interview is how all-encompassing sustainability is. It's really not a tick box exercise that you can kind of put on the side. It really does, when you apply it effectively, sort of seep into the real workings of the organization. I'd like to highlight that a little bit. Could you expand on that? How far can the L&D strategy of sustainability really take them? What effect can you really have?
Well, it depends. I mean, an organization's commitment to sustainability has to come from above. I mean, if senior management, if the ownership of an organization isn't interested in sustainability, then it's always going to be very difficult. Traditionally, learning and development professionals do not have a particularly strong they do not traditionally have very much power within organizations. They often operate in a very reactive mode. And it's been described, by some of the people who write about it as a customer service model. So, the senior management says, we want a training course on X. So human resource development says, yes, fine, we'll deliver a training course on X. The thing is that tends to, I mean, sometimes that's okay, but often it means that people in human resource development who have a deeper understanding about the kinds of issues involved in communicating new ideas to people, that they're not able to put those into practice, and so their skills are suppressed. So I think what we're talking about is trying to, what I'm interested in doing, I've been working in, as you said in your introduction, I've been working in this field for 30 years, and I've constantly been frustrated by the battles I've had with senior management in the various organizations I've had involvement with in terms of trying to influence them to deliver learning and development in different ways. I've been told, we need a course, and I question, do we actually need a course? We need to do it online. Is online actually going to be an effective way of doing this? So I'm constantly trying to push for my own professional expertise to actually get what I know from my experience to be an effective way of getting people to change their behavior and to work in a particular way to do that more effectively. So it is difficult. But I think, if you're working in an organization where, you feel like there needs to be a greater commitment to sustainability, it's about thinking about what are the drivers for that organization. we have to think about, where is the organization going to be in 5 or 10 years time? Is it still going to be here? And if we're not thinking about how society and the environment is changing, and also the political economy within which we operate, the neoliberal model that we have in the United Kingdom and the United States in particular, it's creaking at the seams. I mean, there have been various kind of problems we've had in recent years, the 2008 financial crash, the globalization, which has contributed to the COVID pandemic, the current, disastrous situation in Ukraine, which is kind of fueled in, to use a bad metaphor, in large part by the oil and gas requirements and the capability of Russia and the needs of Western Europe. So there's a kind of, it's an incredibly complex geopolitical world we're moving in. And if organizations don't look to what the world is going to be like for our grandchildren and think, well, how can we start to move towards a practice which actually means that our grandchildren will have a decent world to grow up in, then then the organization may not last that long. So I think one of the roles that learning development can have is actually really sort of think through what are the things pushing the organization to behave more sustainably and to communicate those upwards. So if they feel like there isn't a sufficient driver from above for sustainable practice environmentally and socially, then the role of learning and development professionals should be to act as this kind of moral compass that I've mentioned before, and to highlight that within the organization.
I couldn't agree more, especially the moral compass. You've given such a good call to action, I think, for learning and development specialists everywhere today. I would like to ask you though, do you think your experience in the humanitarian side of things has really driven you forward in terms of that moral responsibility and ethical responsibility? I do think sometimes in the corporate space, as you've mentioned, it's very easy to get caught up in, we just need a course, it'll throw the bottom line, maybe your experience in nonprofits and humanitarian movements has really shaped that side, and we can all learn from it. But I would like to ask you if you think that has been the case.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, the first part of my career, I worked in technical education. I was a technical teacher for a couple of years in the Sudan, and also in West Africa, the Gambia, and also the United Kingdom. So I spent 7 or 8 years as a teacher, and then I actually moved into corporate training and worked a lot in the financial services sector in the United Kingdom. Spent 7 or 8 years there, and then slowly I started to pick up work in the humanitarian sector, and now my work is with the United Nations agencies, not for profits. So I've got a lot of experience in different sectors and with people who look at the world in quite different ways. And I guess one of the things which which I noticed moving into the working a lot with humanitarian organizations was how the kind of people who work in those organizations are very conscious of the particular value framework that they have. They know what is important for them in the world. They're prepared to to sacrifice a lot in terms of where they work and how much they earn and all that kind of thing, in order to make what they think the world is a better place to live in. And that for me contrasted with a lot of the people I worked with in financial services, who were very interested in making money.
So financial services.
Yeah, and there's nothing particularly wrong with making money. I've spent all my life trying to make money, but to make enough money so that I can meet my basic needs, and so that I can bring up my children, and so that I can be an effective person in the world. And so I think that exposure to working with people who have a very strongly developed and well articulated value framework is what is where I come from on this. And I think that's one of the things which I in the the book that I've written about learning and development, and thinking about how learning and development to promote sustainability differs from most learning and development books, is this the importance I attach to getting to understand what the values of your workforce are, what is important to them. I think in management texts there's a distinction between what's described as a unitarist philosophy and a pluralist philosophy. In a unitarist philosophy, the priority of the organization is everything. So the organization decides that it has a strategy to do this, and so everybody in the organization is assumed that they will align themselves to do this. With a pluralist philosophy, the organization says, well, what we need to do is this, but what do you other people in the organization also think about this? And then that opens up a space for employees to say, well, what is really important for me as a member of my community, as a father, as a grandfather, as a member of that local society or whatever, is that that we have this available, that this is done, that this is available, that the organization works in this way. And so by in a pluralist organization, these alternative ideas, these alternative value frameworks are actually brought into the mix of what the organization does. So I think that's perhaps what my experience of working in not-for-profits and humanitarian development oriented organizations has brought for me, and which has been brought home by the research I've done into the whole issue of sustainable human resource development practice.
Amazing. I think just linking to our own values is a very good message for us all, even with outside of the HR space, just to connect to what you really believe and really strive for that. I am going to cut us off a little bit here, Bryan. I think we've had an amazing conversation, a lot to think about, a lot to speak about, just the ethical responsibilities of being a learning and development specialist, really tapping into sustainable living for your organization for the future, environmentally and socially. So I'd really encourage our listeners, if you want to find out more, sign up for the webinar. We'll find out a lot more of the practical aspects of how to actually implement this strategy. And if you'd like to find out more about Bryan, we'll connect to his LinkedIn in the description, as well as his book that he mentioned now. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today, Bryan.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It's been great fun.